So now that we have a blank scene up and ready, let's take a quick tour of the Harmony interface. If you're used to using Adobe programs like Photoshop and Flash, the Harmony interface will probably seem a little strange, but don't worry, you'll get used to it soon. First of all, if you go to your top menu and click Window, Workspace, Workspace, you can see we have a few presets for how the interface can be laid out. I generally just keep things on default and customize it a little bit. So let's look at what you have in the default view. This large area in the center is the canvas. This is where we'll be drawing all of our artwork. You'll notice that this area has two different tabs. These are called views, and by default, it's giving us camera and drawing view. If you right-click, you can see that you can add a bunch of other options to this panel as well. We'll go over what each of these views are in another video, but for now let's just leave the two default tabs. Alongside the drawing area, you can see this column here. These are called art layers. These are layers that come built into every drawing you make. By default, you can see there is one for line and another one for color. It can be a little tricky to understand how these work, so for now just leave the line layer selected. These are a feature that's added in Harmony Advanced. If you ever use Essentials, you won't see these. Then over here on the left, we have our tool palette. This might look a little more familiar. We have some selection tools, a pencil tool, a brush tool, etc. And you can see some of them have this triangle on the bottom right. If you click and hold one of those buttons, it brings up a set of subtools. Now when we get into using these tools, it might seem a little odd how they have all this organized. But don't worry, you'll get used to what's where eventually. We'll go over what each of these is for in our videos about drawing, and we'll touch on these ones here in our lessons about animating. But if you're really curious, you can always hover your mouse over a button for a second, and a tooltip will come up. Harmony actually has some pretty good information in their tooltips. You might already have noticed that when you select different tools, this window over here is changing. That's because this is the Tool Properties window. Each tool has a bunch of different options for how exactly it works. Again, we'll go over these as they come up. Or you can check out the tooltips on these as well, though they might not make sense right now. You can see this window has tabs too. I'll come back to these, but for now let's jump down here to our color palette. This is where we make the color swatches we'll use in our art. This first section is for creating different palettes, or sets of colors for different purposes. So let's say I create a palette and I call it Character 1. And then down here, I'll add a swatch to that palette, and then click that swatch to set the color. We'll look at the cool things that you can do with these color swatches in another video. Along the bottom here is your timeline. This is where the animation happens. Here you'll create more layers of artwork, add drawings, and use keyframe controls to make things move over time. The timeline will be a big topic later in its own video. Now, before we go, let's jump back to these other tabs up here. This is the Library tab. Once we have some artwork, this is where we'll be managing our drawings and saving pieces of art and animation so we can reuse them later. Next, I want to talk about the X-Sheet tab. It's not here by default, but if you right-click, you can add it down here. If you know anything about traditional hand-drawn paper animation, this might look familiar. The exposure sheet, or X-Sheet for short, is a tool traditional animators use to plan their scenes and make sure the right drawing appears on the right frame of the film. You can basically just think of it as a timeline turned vertically. We'll talk more about why you might want to use the X-Sheet when we talk about hand-drawn animation. Now you might have thought I forgot about this top bar up here, but I didn't. I want to use this as an example of how you can customize your interface and save it. The first section up here are buttons you probably won't use. These are buttons for doing things like opening files and saving, which you can do right here in the File menu anyway, or you can just use the keyboard shortcuts. Next to them are things like undo, cut, copy, and paste, and again you'll probably want to use keyboard shortcuts for doing these things anyway. So if you want to get rid of those, you can right-click and just uncheck them from the list. They're the File and Edit ones here. And if you want them back, right-click and check them again. And while we're here, there is a set of tools that's not in the default view, which I want to recommend you make sure you have. Right-click and choose Advanced Animation Tools. We're definitely going to want these for later. Now you can also fine-tune your layout by clicking and dragging on the border between palettes. Or you can temporarily collapse palettes by clicking these arrows. By default, the changes you make get saved to whichever workspace you're currently using. So this one named Default is now the one we currently have set up. If you ever need to get back to the original default interface, just go to Windows, Restore Default Workspace. One last thing. You may have noticed this red line appearing around whatever palette I click on. This is the palette that's currently in focus. This is important because different commands might do different things depending on which palette you're in. For example, the keyboard shortcuts for zoom in and zoom out are 1 and 2. If the canvas is in focus, then it will zoom in and out on the drawing area. But if the timeline is in focus, then it will zoom in and out on the timeline. Now currently, I have to click to change the focus, but I'm actually going to change that in the preferences. I'm just going to go up to my top menu and click on Harmony Advanced and Preferences. On Windows, this would be under Edit Preferences. Now there's a ton of stuff in here you can customize once you get the feel for how you like to work in Harmony. But right now, the option I'm looking for is on the General tab, and it's called Focus on Mouse Enter. I'll check that and then click OK. Now the focus goes to the palette my mouse is over without me having to click. Also in your preferences, you can customize all of your keyboard shortcuts. For example, if you think it's weird that 1 and 2 are your zoom controls, you can set them to Command plus and Command minus like in Photoshop. To do that, you find the command on this list, and then click this box over here and press the new keyboard shortcut on your keyboard. If you need to reset it, click this default box. And if you're used to working in Flash, they even have an option here to make the shortcuts more like they are in Flash. Okay, so now that we know generally what each of these panels are for, in the next set of videos, we'll take a closer look at how each of them is used. First, let's look at the canvas and what all these view tabs and options are for.